1. What is API testing, and why is it important? Answer. API testing involves evaluating the functionalities, performance, reliability, and security of APIs. Consider a scenario where you're testing an e-commerce platform. Instead of testing the entire website with a browser, you might focus on testing the APIs responsible for user authentication, product search, and checkout processes. This approach allows for quicker feedback and better coverage, especially when changes occur. It's important because APIs serve as the backbone for communication between various components of modern software systems. 2. Differentiate between API testing and GUI testing. Answer. API testing involves directly testing the functionalities exposed by APIs, typically through the endpoints, without interacting with the user interface. For example, you might send a POST request to an API endpoint that adds an item to a shopping cart and verify the response. On the other hand, GUI testing involves interacting with the graphical user interface of an application, simulating user actions like clicks, typing, and gestures. API testing is generally more stable, faster, and less prone to UI changes compared to GUI testing. 3. What are the common types of API testing? Answer. Functional testing ensures that API endpoints perform as expected. For instance, testing a weather API by sending a request for the current weather in a specific city and verifying that the response contains the expected weather data. Performance testing involves assessing the response times and throughput of APIs under different loads, like sending thousands of concurrent requests. Security testing focuses on identifying vulnerabilities, such as injection attacks or improper authentication mechanisms, and ensuring data integrity and confidentiality. 4. Explain the importance of API documentation in API testing. Answer. API documentation serves as a crucial resource for developers and testers, providing detailed information about how to interact with the API correctly. For example, consider a RESTful API for a social media platform. The documentation would specify endpoints for actions like creating a post, fetching user information, and updating profile details. Testers rely on this documentation to understand the expected behavior of API endpoints, the structure of request and response payloads, and error handling mechanisms. 5. How do you test API endpoints for various HTTP methods? Answer. Suppose you're testing a user management API. To test the GET method, you'd send a request to the /users endpoint and verify that it returns a list of users. For POST, you'd send a request to create a new user with appropriate data and verify that it's successfully added. Similarly, for PUT and DELETE, you'd update or delete existing users, respectively. For instance, sending a PUT request to /users/id with updated user data and checking if the user details are updated accordingly. 6. What are some common API security vulnerabilities, and how do you mitigate them? Answer. An example of a common API security vulnerability is SQL injection, where attackers exploit poorly sanitized input to execute arbitrary SQL commands. To mitigate this, input validation and parameterized queries should be implemented. Another vulnerability is insecure direct object references, where attackers access unauthorized resources by manipulating object references in API requests. Proper authorization checks and access controls can mitigate this risk. 7. Explain the importance of parameterization in API testing. Answer. Parameterization allows testing the API with different input data to ensure its robustness and reliability. For instance, in testing a payment gateway API, parameterization would involve testing with various payment amounts, currencies, and payment methods to validate the API's behavior under different scenarios. By covering a wide range of inputs, including edge cases and boundary conditions, Parameterized testing helps uncover potential issues and ensures comprehensive test coverage. 8. How do you handle authentication and authorization in API testing? Answer. In API testing, authentication involves sending valid credentials, such as API keys or tokens, with each request to authenticate the client. For example, when testing a banking API, you'd include an API key or token in the request header to access account information. Authorization ensures that authenticated clients have the necessary permissions to access specific resources. Testing should include verifying that authentication mechanisms are correctly implemented and enforced, and unauthorized requests are appropriately handled. 9. What are the best practices for designing effective API test cases? Answer. Effective API test cases should cover both positive and negative scenarios, including boundary conditions and edge cases. For instance, testing a file upload API would involve verifying the behavior when uploading files of different sizes, formats, and with various permissions. Test cases should be independent, reusable, and maintainable to facilitate regression testing and accommodate changes in the API over time. 10. How do you ensure the reliability and performance of APIs? Answer. Reliability and performance of APIs can be ensured through comprehensive testing, including functional testing, load testing, stress testing, and performance monitoring. For example, in testing a payment processing API, load testing would involve simulating multiple concurrent transactions to assess its scalability and response times under heavy loads. Performance monitoring tools can track key performance metrics over time and alert stakeholders to potential issues proactively.